you. If you have difficulty seeing or hearing, please just roll your chairs closer. I'm only doing this because Tuesday and Tim twisted my arm. They wanted to get the most out of me before I keel over.
Right. That's exactly what we said.
So I think what I'm going to say here, I'm going to start a little bit with the background story. And because I think it's still relevant today. It may seem very simplistic what I'm going to say, but it may still be relevant. Tuke and I, Tuke is my husband and partner, Tuke and I started to use these methodologies very early. We were early movers, like mid-90s or something. Yeah, we did a first World Cafe maybe 1 week after the first World Cafe was done in the States. And we read about open space in an article and went out and did it. And so because we were excited about these methodologies and instinctively we felt they were useful. We had worked with conferences earlier with PowerPoints and keynotes and all that. So we felt like it was a long lost friend. When we did these participative processes, two things. When we did these participative processes, people were energized. They were the room was full of energy and people were energized. And I remember in the early days when and of course Juanita Brown had said, make collective knowledge visible. So we plastered all the tablecloths and everything on the wall, and when we left the room, the wall was totally plastered with our post-its. And there were after one of these early meetings, I sat and looked at the wall, and I actually started to read what was on the tablecloths. I was amazed at how much good stuff there actually was on it. And was wondering how much did people walk away with? How much was collective wisdom and knowledge? How much was just in people's individual heads? And so I started to document these. And of course I started to create a little bit more order. For me, the purpose of harvesting is to support the collective sense-making. Peter Senge has a saying, I don't know if I quote him right, and I don't even know if it's his saying, but something like, you can have a group of individually intelligent people, but until that group knows what it knows together, the group itself is not intelligent. So if we work with collective intelligence, you have to create an intelligent group. That's why harvesting for me becomes so important. It's like a feedback loop to say, put the mirror up and say, this is what we're seeing. Is this what you do? Document this. And of course I started to create a little bit more order. For me, the purpose of harvesting is to support the collective sense-making. Peter Senge has a saying, I don't know if I quote him right, and I don't even know if it's his saying, but something like, you can have a group of individually intelligent people, but until that group knows what it knows together, the group itself is not intelligent. So if we work with collective intelligence, you have to create an intelligent group. That's why harvesting for me becomes so important. It's like a feedback loop to say, put the mirror up and say, this is what we're seeing. Is this what you said? Or kind of feedback into our awareness. What is the essence of what we are actually working on? So for me, the bottom line is actually working with collective intelligence. If harvesting doesn't solve that, we shouldn't do it. It's right. Maybe I'm coming out a little bit strong, but that's how I feel. It's like we are working with collective intelligence. That's the bottom line. So whatever you can do to support it. And when Marguerite was reading up all the possibilities you have to harvest, we can end up creating more noise than clarity, potentially. But the purpose of harvesting for me is to create more clarity, more collective clarity. Then let me just speak a little bit about the word harvesting. If you hate it, I'm partly responsible, I'm sorry. I didn't invent it, but it was almost like what we did wasn't minutes. It's different than minutes. And
at the same time, I really like to demystify harvesting because we are harvesting all the time. Our brain works as a harvester. We take in everything, and then there's part of our brain that flags what is important. And that's what becomes conscious knowledge to us. So when I explained what I was doing when we were doing harvesting, a woman in Johannesburg that we work with said, that's actually how the brain works. So you actually sort out the stuff, you cluster it, you synthesize it, you prioritize it to source out the most important patterns and the most important messages that you can then reflect back to the group. But the word harvesting, so we need it, so demystify. And the newspaper is a harvest of previous days' events around the world. A PhD is a harvest. It's like a book is a harvest. So harvest, we do this all the time. We do this sense making all the time. The difference for me, why we felt the need to have a different word, it was like harvesting the fruits of these conversations, not letting them go to waste. And that word or that metaphor is not even adequate. Because when you think about the metaphor of harvesting, it happens, there's a lot happening before and then you harvest. And I have been part of processes where we have happily prepared, I don't know what we have prepared, because just before we enter the event, we say, what should we harvest? It's like, this has happened, this happens often. The worst case scenario is when you've had a rich event and you stand with all the posters on the wall and say, oh shit, what am I going to do with all this? It's like, you know this, right? So it's like I sometimes have a very leading question when I introduce harvesting. It's like, when does the farmer start to think about the harvest? It's consciously in the mind the whole time. So harvesting, again back to the word, we both the hosting and the harvesting, we kind of had to find a different word to kind of explain something slightly different than what we already know. And there's this, Wittgenstein has this saying that words enable worlds. So sometimes you have to change the word to actually signal that you're meaning something slightly different. So the hosting, sometimes people ask me, especially when we work with facilitators or facilitators, as one of our Australian we were working with some disability organization in Australia, and one of the people with Down syndrome said, I know what you are. You're a facilitator. So that's my word. So I just felt that we needed a different word than facilitation, because facilitation for me, in my understanding, applies that you know where people need to go. And when we work with emergence, we don't know where people need to end up. We kind of have a boundary condition. Like I used to say in the commission, when I say living systems you cannot control. You can only nudge them or inspire them. Sometimes people get white in their face, totally can't control what you can't control. And I say, if you want to control anything, don't control the outcome. Control the boundary conditions if you need to, but not the outcome. Because then otherwise you can't work with emergence. I'm jumping a little bit here. So hosting. So when people ask me, why do you call it hosting? Or what's the difference between especially talking in high-stake organizations, you could say there's something that's collective. There's a collective harvest. There's an individual. I use this quite often to give individual. I don't know. Yeah. And there's this is external or visible, tangible. And this is internal or intangible. So when I go into organizations and we need to do a participative process and then also work with the harvest. The focus is extremely much on this side, on the collective tangible. What is the concrete thing that comes out of it? Like reports, action plans, documentations, websites, and all the artifacts, I call them strategic artifacts. So in one sense, you need to be good at this. In a way, it helps if you learn how to do this, to pacify the anxiety that sometimes is in organizations that we're not delivering enough. On the other side here, internal and intangible, there's a lot of stuff here. I usually tell them that when you do a participative process, there's a name for this. It's called social capital. So when you do participatory processes, social capital is almost always unfortunately, there is a fancy name for it now. Social capital is almost always a byproduct. And so this would be like the mind shifts that happens collectively, or the relationships we build, or the trust that comes when we learn to know each other. All this soft stuff that's intangible and very hard to show, or hard to measure. And I'm really curious to know, those of you who work with evaluation, if you have found a way to measure this and evaluate this, I'd like to learn it. So that's what I'm excited about this gathering, because you bring different knowledge here, and I'm waiting to go into the open space and have conversations with it. So the mind shift here, when it's collective, I guess the mind shift and the relationship starts here too, in the individual. I actually think that this part here is the energy and the motivation and all that stuff that can make this part move. If this energy isn't there and the mind shift isn't there, it's difficult to create any change at all, even if you have perfect artifacts. So you can make the most creative artifacts if you don't work with the root systems. I'll come back to that a little bit. You're not going to have a good result. So a mind shift starts here, and then maybe it's a collective mind shift, and then maybe we can move something here. And then, of course, there are our own journals and notes and doodles, and when we share them, and it can become a collective, it comes here. Yeah. So this is what I call strategic harvesting. This part here, which is probably what organizations focus on. At least I work a lot have worked a lot in the European Commission, which is like the administrative body of the European Union. It's the ministries of the European Union, and they are using participatory methods quite a lot. So it's become part of their culture, but they tend to focus a lot here. So this is where we do our processes. You could say there's a time before, then there's an event or a series of events, and then there's a time after. So we had a conversation here in our little circle when we checked in, and a few of us went straight to the jugular. It's like when we harvest these enormous, incredible stories, and the CEO or whoever it is that's supposed to receive them doesn't want to receive them. Or I hear in the commission, we had a wonderful process. We did a really good harvest and nothing came out. What's the problem? And for me, the problem lies here. That you need to start here. This is where you create the root for it. I feel I'm going to talk a little bit about the roles that I find myself working in. So, much to my surprise, I started by working with the artifacts that came out in this end. And the more I got involved in it, the more I found that I'm actually, maybe there's more than 4 roles, but I can see clearly 4 roles I'm having. The first role I'm having is really to be a consultant and a coach. If I cannot create a commitment from the CEO up front here to actually create the space to receive whatever is coming, I might advise them not to even go there. So or I might try to create the acceptance that things can come up here that you are not really wanting to hear. Are you ready for it? I feel it's our responsibility as harvesters, as harvest people, to consult whoever is the decision maker, what is possible and what it implies if we go this way. So my first role is the consultant or coach. Then one big shift happened to me when I started to see myself as hosting a harvest process rather than being a harvester, which is an agricultural tool. Has nothing to do with what we are doing. So, no, that's the other one. If you see yourself as hosting the harvest throughout this process, you will think about it differently. You will also host the follow-up. That doesn't mean that I get hired to do the follow-up, because quite often I don't. If I talk about the follow-up like an impact assessment here, someone, they think I'm trying to sell them more hours. And so, but we contract minimum to a follow-up meeting here where we present the harvest and talk about it. But we consult already on this upfront. So I feel a responsibility to follow up and follow through, if the best I can. So that was my hosting the harvest. And hosting the harvest also for me means hosting the harvest team. In the beginning, when I was starting to do these documentations, I actually took everything and transcribed it and kind of ordered it, clustered it, synthesized, prioritized it, and ordered it a little bit pictures. Made a nice documentation, but sometimes the documentation was this thick because there was everything there. It's like a record, memory of the meeting. And as I was doing that, I felt I really learned enormous amounts about that organization, about their worries, concerns, opportunities, and I felt like I'm not going to use this for anything. And I felt the CEO needed to know this, but I didn't. And I had the feeling when I sent that thick documentation that he's not going to take time, he or she is not going to take time to read. Oh, I didn't know they would. So I started to think of other ways of how could I make it more effective? How can I make it more palatable and digestible? And have experimented with different ways. But the point of it is that when we had a meeting with 200 people, and I sat and processed the results, it's like having 200 brain cells in your brain to think about it, and one remote brain cell here to make sense of it. This doesn't make sense to me. It doesn't. If it was our brain, we would be basket cases. Because I have my take on it, and I see when I work together with a team that everybody has a slightly different take. So my principle, I'm going to put some of them out there, but my main principle today is try and build into the design as much as possible so that the sense making is part of the design and is done collectively as much as possible. What I cannot do, if I don't have the ability to build everything in, at least I need to have a diverse team to look at the material, and I need somebody who understands content very well, because I don't understand every content. I can understand the process of harvesting a little bit, but so for instance, when I go into the European Commission and work with agriculture policy, what do I know about it? Nothing. I can read a little bit, but I'll never be an expert. So I need to work together with people who understand content, and content and process together can create something. So, and I help sometimes to fill this role, which I call a strategist. So for me, harvesting is super strategic because I notice I work a lot with talker. And some people they actually call them animators in the commission. They animate people to talk. And others are more like in the convergent, like sense makers. And I'd probably be more sense maker, at least I have a need to make sense. So I find that it's easy to get people talking. You can have a question in the cafe or in the open space that can get people to talk. And sometimes when I work with even experienced hosts, processors, extremely experienced processors, two things. First of all, they can create questions that can get people talking, but when I read the question, it might have 3 questions inside. And I say, which one am I going to harvest? Is this the right question I'm going to ask? Because the question you ask is what people are going to answer. So the questions matter. So if you, the questions really matter. How, blah, blah, blah. What, blah, 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 gives a different result. So I'm sometimes a pain in the butt for people because I really want to ask what is it we are asking and trying to taste what's coming out of it if I ask this question. What am I getting? Because I need to deal with the data. And if the data is messy, I'm lost. I'm totally lost. I can't deal with it. And the other thing is, I lost it. Happens. There's one more thing I wanted to say about it. What was the question? Oh, no, maybe it will come back. It's everything. Anyway, I'll go on. Maybe it will come back. Yes, I remember what it was. Just a little slower than it used to be. The other thing is, when we are in shortage of, so when we design our process, design for time for harvesting. We always give it a little bit of like 10 minutes in the end or 5 minutes in the end. And if somehow the time goes over time, that's the first thing we calculate. So I've been in high-stake meetings in the Commission where we have planned for a harvest, actually have a harvest template with some questions. Last minute, the host comes and scratches it, said, we don't have time. So what we do is, they've had an intense conversation, and then what we do is have a few popcorns, and I take note of the popcorns, and I look at it and I say, this is useless. I can't use this for anything. Or I can try and make it sound like something, but I know there's no weight behind it or anything. So for me, the questions are important, the time is important, how I capture this output is important, how I deal with the data is important. And and so the last role is kind of the actually being the harvester, doing the nitty-gritty stuff, which is actually I would recommend to anybody, because if you have to deal with a lot of data, you would think about your design differently. So
say that last sentence again.
if you have to deal with data from 200 people, 500 people, or even 20 people, you will think about your design differently. You will, because if you ask 3 questions in one question to 500 people, you can 3 times 500 or whatever. Or if you have a cafe with 5, you 3 times, it's still 300 pieces of data you're dealing with. So you really think about what am I asking, how am I asking it, and how can I capture it or deal with it. Okay, we talked about the
Could
basic.
I add
Yeah.
one thing, just for those of you who maybe not have experience working on this level? When Monica gives examples from the European Commission, the result of the harvest in more and more cases over the last 5 years goes to the European Parliament and becomes policy, but based upon the harvest. So this is what she calls high stake. European Parliament governs 500 million people, 28 nation states in Europe. We never dreamt when we began to experiment with this in the early 90s that it would go to this level. But it has, and in more and more places, this is, in municipalities in Denmark, a lot of decisions are being influenced by the stakeholders in these kind of things. So we were forced to become rigorous about it and never to work alone. Monica's working with sometimes 5 or 10 employees in the European Commission. commission, who knows the content, and she's also training them to be able to work on this level. So just to give it a little bit bigger context.
And also to come back to this, the best processes we've done in the commission, for instance, are the ones where the CEO or the stakeholder, they have something at stake. They really know they need to use what's coming out here. Or like one of the one with agriculture policy, 200 people, stakeholder engagement from different member states, was a beautiful, beautiful harvest experience for me, because the harvesting was totally woven into the design. So when we had done a World Cafe, yeah, we did a bigger harvest, and then some people from that directorate clustered it and actually spoke back in a qualified way what came out of it, out of those clusters. So it wasn't just paper on the wall. And that became ground for the next conversation and so forth. So it felt like the harvesting and the hosting were totally yin-yang woven. By the way, I've asked Chris to interject, or any one of you to interject if there's something you want to say or ask. And somebody asked me in the toilet if this really is the first practitioners gathering, and I think definitely this size, but I was thinking 10 years ago, Chris and I had a small practitioners gathering in Phil Cass's kitchen, yeah, and actually wrote a little something about the harvesting, which I'm not sure I'm recommending anymore, but maybe some of it is still there. So I'm kind of getting to then we can have maybe a little bit more exchange, and you can see if you have things to add and stuff. I just want to put a few principles up that I use, that I use when I try and design a harvest. By the way, sometimes it doesn't work. So it's not that all the harvest stuff I do is really no, some are really depressing. So let the harvesting support the collective intelligence of wisdom. Sometimes I see harvesting left, right, and center. We actually end up creating more noise than more clarity. So be a little bit aware. Sometimes less is more. And so the simplicity principle we were suggesting can be a good principle.
What did it say?
So let the harvesting support our collective intelligence, our clarity, our collective clarity and wisdom. So if it doesn't support it, don't do it. Let harvesting be part of your thinking from the very beginning. Just start here. It's not very distinct here yet, but you have an intention already. And then there's one thing that's really useful when we talk more about clarify who needs to harvest and for what purpose. Sometimes there are more than one person that needs it, and they need different things. So, and then I mentioned this already. Build the sense making into the design as much as possible. You can do a lot by an intelligent design, so that people actually make the choices and surface the nuggets that you want to keep. Host the harvesting process. Think of yourself as a host of that whole process. And this one too. You can come closer and read them. These are not big enough to read at a distance. Don't leave loose ends. I don't ask people to harvest anything that I'm not going to use. It's almost like being disrespectful, and sometimes it's enough to just speak something into the room. I mean, sometimes a popcorn harvest is enough. It doesn't always need to be written or in deep detail. Sometimes that's enough to inform the room to go to the next step, and to also discern that. But if I ask them to really harvest something, it is because I'm going to use it for something. It's not going to just hang on the wall. And harvesting is strategic. And then the last one, there is no substitute for using your common sense. There is, somebody wanted to have a best practice. I don't think there is a best practice. I think we have some examples of good harvests that have worked, but that's in the commission too. They asked me, what do I do in this and that? I said, it depends. It depends on the context. depends who needs the harvest. It depends on all these things. So in one way, I have to create it from scratch every time, even though, of course, I can use some of the stuff I've learned. But there's no substitute to your common sense. And also how you already know you can deal with data. That's good stuff. I have some questions too. I think I lost them. No, they're here. I don't know if they're relevant. Yeah, one question I have is, how could we become better at the real-time collective sense-making, elegantly and simply? So that's a question I'm really in. One question, what does it really take to make this fully integrated part of our hosting a conversation? Because the opening seems to be easy, but then the emergent and then start to converge seems a bit more difficult. And when you do a meeting like this, it's hardly ever you converge to a total clarity at the end. But you may end up with 5 options of possibilities that you have to then explore further. So it's not always you get totally to that one insight. Let's see if there's anything else. Yes, I do have a question, which may not be a question for you. How do you use information and communication technology intelligently in this context? What's possible? And I know these technologies can fail, so I think it's important to know what you do hands-on with paper. We have had really good experiences where the technology failed, and thank God we had a paperback plan B. So, but I think it can help our data sorting and all that stuff and make it easier for us. And then I have a question also that lives with me. Who should decide what's meaningful? It's like, how much do we need to listen to the fringe voices and the wisdom at the fringes? And how much is it the majority that comes? And I don't know. I don't have the answer. I know that there's a message in that many people say, this is important. Of course, I listen to that. But sometimes the interesting stuff is in the fringes, and I don't know. I can't give 80% attention to that either. But it's interesting to not forget it and to listen to it. And the other thing is, like I talked about, the basic process of dealing with lots of data is to cluster and then synthesize and prioritize, or not always in that order, but to distill the messages. Main messages. But sometimes when you distill the main messages, they are so simplified, black and white, that you lose all the color. I think you call it granularity or something. But you lose the detail. So I could go to most organizations and distill what they're saying and come out with, we need better internal communication. We need more cross-silo cooperation or something like this. You could almost guess it ahead of time. So unless you give more detail to it, where exactly is the shoe not fitting, or where exactly is it, then it's useless data again. It's like this fine balance between detail and clarity. Yeah, interesting field. I think I don't want to say no on your problem. Yeah. Anybody have anything, please? Add.